In the sleepy village of Willowbrook, a harmless old lady receives a mysterious letter sealed in scarlet wax, begging her to burn a photograph that could destroy a noble engagement and reopen a 20-year-old yachting accident. Miss Jane Marple, knitting by the fire, refuses to destroy evidence and instead unravels a web of blackmail, faked death, and hidden negatives. One midnight rendezvous in a fog-shrouded mill, a gunshot in the dark, and a final flame in Scotland Yard later. The captain's smile curls into ash, a terrified mother's secret is laid bare, and a young bride's future is saved, proving that in the quietest corners of England, the deadliest truths are solved not by police, but by a gentle spinster who sees murder in a turned-away face. Chapter 1. The Arrival of the Letter. The village of Willowbrook lay drowsing under a pale October sun, its thatched cottages and trim hedgerows presenting that picture of rural tranquility which so often conceals the sharper emotions of human nature. In one of the smaller houses on the lane that led to the Church Linden cottage, to be precise, Miss Jane Marple sat by her sitting-room window, her fingers busy with a ball of pale blue wool and a pair of clicking needles. She was knitting a bed jacket for the autumn bazaar, though she had already unraveled the border twice. The pattern, she reflected mildly, was more suited to a younger and more impatient pair of hands than hers. The clock on the mantelpiece struck 11 with its usual gentle insistence. Outside, the postman's bicycle bell gave a single ting as Mr. Higgins propped it against the gate. He was a cheerful man with a red face and a habit of humming hymn tunes off-key. Today it was Rock of Ages, somewhat flattened by the exertion of the hill. Miss Marple laid down her knitting, smoothed the skirt of her dove-gray wool dress, and went to the door. "Morning, miss," said Mr. Higgins, touching his cap. "3 for you today." There was the seed catalogue from Sutton's, a bill from the drapers for 2 yards of curtain material, and unexpectedly a thick cream envelope addressed in a hand that sloped sharply to the right, as though the writer had been in a hurry or a temper. The ink was black, the paper expensive, and the seal a blob of scarlet wax bearing the impression of a signet ring. A single initial R, entwined with what might have been a dolphin or a serpent. Miss Marple's eyesight, though sharp for faces and motives, was less reliable for heraldic niceties. She thanked Mr. Higgins, closed the door, and carried the little sheaf to the round mahogany table beneath the window. The catalogue and the bill she set aside. The envelope she turned over once, twice, with the deliberation of a connoisseur examining a dubious coin. She had received anonymous letters before, mostly complaints about the church organist's new voluntary or the vicar's. Sermons running over 20 minutes, but none sealed with wax since the war. Her silver letter opener, a wedding present to her mother in 1879, lay ready in the drawer. She slit the flap with precision, drew out a single sheet folded once, and unfolded it beneath the green-shaded reading lamp. The message was brief, written in the same impatient hand. "My dear Miss Marple, you do not know me, but I know of you. Years ago, in a moment of folly, I committed an act that has haunted me ever since. The enclosed will explain. Burn this after reading, and the other with it. Your discretion is my only hope. E.R. That was all. No date, no address, only the initials." Tucked inside the fold was a second envelope, smaller and thinner, also sealed with the same red wax. Miss Marple's mild blue eyes rested upon it for a long moment. She had no immediate acquaintance with the initials E.R., though memory, that faithful if sometimes tardy servant, stirred faintly at the back of her mind. She rose, crossed to the fireplace, where a modest fire of coal and apple wood burned, and held the corner of the outer sheet above the flames. The paper curled, blackened, but she withdrew it before it caught. Burning, she reflected, was a counsel of despair, and despair, in her experience, was rarely the wisest adviser. She returned to her chair, placed both envelopes upon the small table beside her teacup still half full, The tea now lukewarm, and resumed her knitting. The wool slipped through her fingers with soothing rhythm. Click, click, click. Outside, a robin perched on the gatepost and regarded her with bright, impertinent eyes. Miss Marple smiled at it absently. Human beings, she thought, were apt to dramatize their secrets. Yet secrets, like knitting patterns, often unraveled if one merely pulled the right thread. She would open the inner envelope presently. First, she would finish the row. Chapter 2. The Photograph. Miss Marple completed the row with the neatness of long practice, slipped the needles into the ball of wool, and laid the half-finished bed-jacket across the arm of her chair. The fire had settled into a steady glow, throwing soft reflections on the polished brass fender and the row of china dogs along the mantelpiece. She drew the green-shaded lamp a fraction closer, adjusted her spectacles, and took up the inner envelope. It was lighter than the first, as though it contained no more than a card or a pressed flower. The seal, again, was the scarlet wax with the entwined arm. Miss Marple turned it over once, listening to the faint crackle of the coal, then slit the flap with the same silver opener. From within slid a photograph cabinet size, the edges slightly foxed, the surface protected by a thin sheet of tissue that fluttered to the carpet like a moth. She lifted the photograph to the light. It showed two figures standing on what was clearly the deck of a yacht, teak planking underfoot, a coil of rope in the background, and beyond that the dark sheen of water under a night sky. The man was in naval uniform white drill jacket with epaulettes, the cap tilted at a rakish angle. His face was turned 3/4 towards the camera, strong features, a mustache waxed to points, eyes narrowed in laughter or defiance. Miss Marple recognized him at once. Captain Reginald Haverford, R.N., retired, or rather, presumed lost at sea some 20 years earlier in the much-discussed tragedy off the Lizard. Beside him stood a woman in evening dress of the fashion of the early 30s, low-waisted, silver lame that caught what little light there was, a long rope of pearls, and a feather stole slipping from one shoulder. Her head was turned away from the lens, as though she had moved at the instant the shutter clicked. Only the curve of a cheek and the line of a dark bob were visible. One gloved hand rested on the captain's sleeve. The other held a cigarette in a holder of amber. On the back, in the same hurried script as the covering letter, someone had written, "Taken the night before he vanished." She swore it was accident. "I know better." Miss Marple laid the photograph upon the table and considered it with the detached interest she might have accorded a curious beetle pinned to a card. Captain Haverford's death had made the newspapers for a week or two. A sudden squall. A yacht found drifting with only 2 women aboard. The captain washed overboard. The inquest had been held at Penzance. The verdict, accidental death. There had been talk there, always was, of money troubles, of a large insurance policy, of the captain's taste for brandy and fast company. Yet the talk had died away, as talk does, and the widow had married again within the year, this time to an American manufacturer of motor cars, who had himself died of heart failure in 1937. Miss Marple reached for her small Morocco-bound notebook, the one she kept for jottings about the garden, and turned to a fresh page. With a pencil she wrote, in her neat, sloping hand, "Haverford Case Yacht, Sea Nymph, the 14th of August 1932. Present. Capt. R.H. Mrs. R.H., nee Sylvia Grayson. Miss Evelyn Rutherford, cousin. Crew dismissed at Falmouth for the night. Storm rose 11 p.m. Body not recovered. Insurance £25,000. Widow remarried 1933 to J.P. Vanderbilt. Died 1937. She paused, nibbling the end of the pencil. The name Evelyn Rutherford tugged at memory like a loose thread. Not a common name. She closed her eyes and let the years slide backward. There had been a girl at the Hydro in Leamington Spa 1935, or perhaps 36 tall, dark, with a nervous trick of twisting her handkerchief. She had spoken of a cousin lost at sea, of nightmares, of a photograph she could not bring herself to destroy. Miss Marple had listened, as she always did, and had said little. People confided in her because she looked harmless, and because she never repeated what was told her in confidence, unless, of course, it became necessary for the prevention of murder. She opened her eyes. The photograph still lay on the table, the captain's smile fixed forever. Miss Marple picked it up again and studied the woman's profile. The angle was maddening. One could not be certain. Yet the set of the shoulders, the way the stole slipped, there was something familiar. She rose, crossed to the bookcase, and drew out a bound volume of the Tatler for 1931. It took her only a moment to find the page she wanted. A charity ball at the Savoy. A group of debutantes. There, third from the left, was Miss Evelyn Rutherford, aged 19, in white satin and a tiara of brilliance. The cheekbone, the line of the jaw, yes, it was the same. So the woman in the photograph was Evelyn Rutherford, and the writer of the letter was E.R., the same person. Miss Marple replaced the magazine and returned to her chair. The fire had sunk a little. She added a knob of coal from the scuttle, watching the blue flames lick upward. Why, after 20 years, should Miss Rutherford, or Mrs. Rutherford, as she must now, be send such a photograph to a stranger with instructions to burn it? Fear, obviously. But fear of what? The past was past. The inquest had closed the matter. Unless new evidence had surfaced, or unless someone threatened to reopen the case. Blackmail, perhaps. Or the simpler terror of a daughter's engagement being blighted by an old scandal. Miss Marple's mind moved with the precision of a well-kept clock. She recalled the engagement notices in the Times during the past week. There had been one, Rutherford Denham. The engagement is announced between Caroline, only daughter of Mrs. Evelyn Rutherford of Cadogan Square, and the late Mr. Henry Rutherford, and the Hun Geoffrey Denham, elder son of Lord Denham of Denham Abbas, Wiltshire. Lord Denham was a stickler for propriety. His son would inherit the title and a considerable fortune. A whisper of murder attached to the bride's mother would be more than inconvenient. She turned the photograph over again and read the words on the back. She swore it was accident. I know better. The she must be the captain's widow, Sylvia. But what did Evelyn know that contradicted the official verdict? And why confess, however, obliquely to a village spinster noted for her interest in crime? Miss Marple placed the photograph and both letters inside the pages of her notebook, closed it, and slipped it into the capacious handbag that hung on the back of her chair. She then rose, drew the curtains against the gathering dusk, and rang the small brass bell on the mantelpiece. Almost at once the door opened to admit Clara, her maid, a stout woman of 50, with a face like a kindly suet pudding. Clara, I shall want the spare room prepared. I am expecting a visitor tomorrow, Mrs. Rutherford, from London. She will probably arrive by the afternoon train, and perhaps a little cold salmon for luncheon. The vicar sent a nice piece from the river. Clara bobbed. Very good, miss. Shall I lay a fire in the spare room? Yes, and see that the hot water bottle is filled. October evenings are treacherous. When Clara had gone, Miss Marple stood for a moment by the window, looking out at the quiet lane. A boy on a bicycle rattled past, whistling. Somewhere a dog barked. All was as it should be in Willowbrook, yet beneath the surface she felt the familiar stir of currents running deep and dark. She returned to her chair, picked up her knitting, and began the next row. The wool slipped through her fingers with soothing monotony. Click, click, click. But her thoughts were far from bed jackets and church bazaars. They were on a yacht deck 20 years ago, on a man who had laughed at death an hour before it claimed him, and on a woman who had carried guilt like a hidden brooch ever since. The fire settled into ruby embers. Outside, the first star pricked the indigo sky. Miss Marple knitted on, serene and deadly as a watching cat. Chapter 3. The visitor from London. The London train was due at Willowbrook Halt at 23 minutes past 3. and Miss Marple, who believed in punctuality as a minor virtue, arrived at the little station with 5 minutes to spare. She wore her second-best tweed coat, a felt hat with a modest pheasant's feather, and carried a small brown umbrella, though the sky was clear. The station-master, Mr. Trigg, touched his cap and remarked that it was a fine afternoon for October. "Indeed it is," Miss Marple replied. "I am meeting Mrs. Rutherford from town. She is a connection of the Haverford's Captain Haverford. You remember." Mr. Trigg's eyebrows rose a fraction. "The one what was drowned? Aye, I mind it. Sad business." He would have enlarged upon the topic, but the whistle of the approaching train cut him short. The single carriage disgorged a porter, a commercial traveler with sample cases, and finally the lady in question. Mrs. Evelyn Rutherford was tall, dressed in London black coat of fine wool, small hat with a veil, gloves of kid leather. She carried a dressing case and a small attach. Her face, seen through the veil, was pale, the mouth drawn tight. She looked, Miss Marple thought, like a woman who had not slept. "Mrs. Rutherford?" "I am Jane Marple. The taxi is waiting." The visitor gave a start, as though recognition were unexpected. "You are very kind. I hardly know how to begin." "Beginnings are best left until one is seated comfortably," Miss Marple said, taking the dressing case. "The cab is only a 2-seater, but we shall manage." The drive to Linden Cottage took 7 minutes. Mrs. Rutherford sat very straight, hands clasped upon her handbag, and said nothing until they turned into the lane. "I wrote to you yesterday," she began abruptly. "You did," Miss Marple agreed. "And you telephoned the inn this morning to confirm the time of your train. I trust the journey was not too fatiguing." Mrs. Rutherford gave a short, nervous laugh. "You know everything, it seems. Only what is necessary," Miss Marple said mildly. "Here we are." Clara had the door open before the taxi stopped. She took the luggage with a murmur and disappeared upstairs. Miss Marple led the way into the sitting-room, where a fresh fire burned and the tea-tray waited. Thin bread and butter, scones still warm, a Victoria sponge, and a pot of Earl Grey under a quilted cozy. Mrs. Rutherford removed her hat and veil, revealing dark hair touched with gray at the temples, and eyes that were red-rimmed. She was perhaps 42 or 3, but anxiety had etched finer lines about her mouth. "Tea first," Miss Marple said, pouring. "Sugar?" "2 lumps, please." "I have not eaten since breakfast." They drank in silence for a minute. Then Mrs. Rutherford set down her cup. "You have the letter and the photograph?" "They are safe." "I beg you to burn them." "At once, in my presence." Miss Marple buttered a scone with deliberation. "My dear, burning is a serious step. Once done, there is no recalling. Tell me why it is necessary." Mrs. Rutherford's fingers twisted the handkerchief in her lap. "My daughter Caroline is engaged to Geoffrey Denham, Lord Denham's son. The notice appeared last week. If any hint of the old scandal reaches his family, the engagement will be broken. Lord Denham is proud. He would never countenance a connection with murder." "The inquest said accident," Miss Marple observed. "Officially, yes, but there were whispers. Reginald Captain Haverford was my cousin. I was on the yacht that night. There were only 3 of us, Reginald, his wife Sylvia, and myself. The crew had been given shore leave at Falmouth. We dined aboard, drank rather too much. Reginald was always generous with the brandy, and about 11 a squall came up. Reginald went on deck to see to the sails. Sylvia followed. There was an argument. I heard raised voices, and a cry, a splash. By the time I reached the deck, Sylvia was alone, clinging to the rail, screaming that he had fallen overboard. We searched with the dinghy, but the sea was running high. Next morning the yacht was found drifting. The Coast Guard took us off. The body was never recovered." She paused, breathing quickly. "And the photograph?" Miss Marple prompted. "I took it myself, earlier that evening. Reginald insisted on a picture set. It would be a memento of our last cruise. Sylvia hated cameras. She turned away at the last moment. After the inquest, I kept the print. I told myself it was for memory's sake, but really, her voice dropped. Really, I was not sure. Sylvia swore it was accident, but she inherited everything. And she remarried so soon. Miss Marple refilled the cups. You wrote in your letter that you knew better than accident. Mrs. Rutherford flushed. I was distraught when I wrote that. Grief, shock, call it what you will. I have lived with doubt for 20 years. Now, with Caroline's future at stake, I cannot bear the uncertainty. If the photograph surfaces, someone will remember, someone will talk. Please destroy it. Miss Marple looked at her thoughtfully. You came alone? Yes. My husband died 2 years ago. Caroline is in Switzerland, finishing school. And no one knows you are here? No one. Mrs. Rutherford's eyes filled with tears. You will do it? Miss Marple rose, crossed to the fireplace, and took a spill from the jar on the mantel. She lit it at the coals, and held it poised. First, one question. The handwriting on the back of the photograph, is it yours? Mrs. Rutherford hesitated. Yes, I wrote it years ago, in a moment of anger. I was wrong. Miss Marple let the spill burn down almost to her fingers, then dropped it into the grate. Very well. She went to the small bureau, unlocked a drawer, and took out the notebook in which she had placed the letters and photograph. Opening it, she drew out the cabinet print and held it to the light. The captain's smile seemed to mock them both. Mrs. Rutherford watched, breath suspended. Miss Marple laid the photograph upon the coals. For a moment nothing happened. Then the corner curled, blackened, and a flame leaped upward. The silver lame dress vanished first, then the naval uniform, finally the 2 faces. The covering letter and its enclosure followed. In less than a minute nothing remained but ash. There, Miss Marple said quietly. It is done. Mrs. Rutherford sank back in her chair, covering her face with her hands. Thank you. You cannot know what this means. Miss Marple rang for fresh tea. You will stay the night, of course. The last train to town is at 7:30, and you look exhausted. Clara has prepared the spare room. Mrs. Rutherford began a protest, but weariness overcame her. If it is not too much trouble. None at all. When Clara had shown the visitor upstairs, Miss Marple stood for a long time looking into the fire. The ash was gray and powdery. No trace remained of the yacht, the captain, or the woman who had turned her face away. Yet Miss Marple's memory was not so easily destroyed. She could see the photograph still, the angle of the head, the gloved hand on the sleeve, the feather still slipping. She went to the telephone in the hall and dialed a London number. Whitehall 1212, said a crisp voice. Scotland Yard, please. I should like to speak to Inspector Craddock, if he is available. Chapter 4. The shadow of the past Inspector Dermot Craddock arrived at Willowbrook. Halt on the milk train at 6:30 the following morning. Having travelled down from Paddington in a third-class carriage that smelled of damp mackintoshes and wet dogs. He was a tall young man with a deceptively mild manner and eyes that missed very little. Miss Marple had known him since he was a small boy in short trousers, and she had once extricated him from a misunderstanding involving a stolen bicycle and the vicar's gooseberries. He found Linden Cottage already awake. Clara, in curl papers and a wrapper, admitted him with a mixture of awe and indignation at the hour. Miss Marple, fully dressed in dove-gray and lace jabot, was breaking her fast on toast and Cooper's Oxford marmalade. "My dear Dermot," she said, rising to greet him, "you must be perished. Sit by the fire and have some coffee. Clara, another cup, if you please." The inspector obeyed, stretching long legs towards the blaze. "Your telephone message was cryptic, Aunt Jane. Old scandal, possible murder, urgent. I caught the first train I could." Miss Marple poured coffee with the same calm she might have used to pour tea for the Mothers' Union. "You remember the Haverford case? 1932, Yacht off the Lizard. Vaguely. Before my time at the Yard. Captain washed overboard. Wife and cousin only survivors. Verdict accidental. Precisely. The cousin, Mrs. Evelyn Rutherford, was here yesterday. She brought a photograph taken the night of the tragedy and begged me to burn it. I did so in her presence. Craddock's eyebrows rose. You burned evidence? I burned a photograph and 2 letters. But I have an excellent memory. She recited the contents of the letters and described the photograph in minute detail, down to the amber cigarette holder and the dolphin on the signet ring. Mrs. Rutherford is convinced someone means to use the picture to ruin her daughter's engagement to young Denham. She came in terror, left in relief. Yet I am uneasy. Why? Because she lied. The handwriting on the back of the photograph, she swore it was accident. I know better, was not hers. I compared it with the letter she admitted writing. The slope is different, the pressure heavier. Someone else wrote those words. Craddock whistled softly. Blackmail? Or worse, Mrs. Rutherford left by the 7.30 train last night. I put her into the carriage myself. But suppose someone followed her here, someone who knew of the letters? The inspector reached for another piece of toast. You think the house was watched? I think it possible. And there is another thing. Miss Marple opened her notebook and showed him the page of jottings. Captain Haverford's insurance was £25,000 payable only in the event of accidental death. The policy lapsed for non-payment 3 weeks before the voyage. If he died by accident, his widow received nothing. If by murder, the same. But if he did not die at all— Craddock stared. You suggest he staged his own disappearance? It has been done. A body never recovered. A storm. 2 hysterical women ideal conditions. But 20 years is a long time. Why surface now? Before he could answer, Clara knocked and entered, bearing a small silver salver. Beg pardon, miss. This came by the second post. She proffered a cheap blue envelope addressed in pencil. Miss Marple, Linden Cottage, Willowbrook. Miss Marple slid it open. Inside was a single sheet of lined paper torn from an exercise book. You burned the wrong picture. I have the real one. £500 or it goes to the Denhams and the police. Instructions follow. Come alone. No signature. Craddock read it over her shoulder. Posted in London yesterday afternoon, before Mrs. Rutherford left here. Someone knew she was coming. Miss Marple folded the note carefully. The photograph I burned was a copy. The original is still in existence. And the writer believes I have money to pay. Will you inform Mrs. Rutherford? Not yet. She is frightened enough. But we must find the original and the person who wrote on the back. Craddock stood up. I'll put a man on the London end, check the postmark. Watch Mrs. Rutherford's house. You will stay here? For the moment. I have my roses to see to, and the WI meeting this afternoon. But I shall keep my eyes open. After the inspector had gone, promising to telephone that evening, Miss Marple donned her gardening gloves and went out to the border where the late chrysanthemums glowed bronze and yellow. She worked steadily, snipping dead heads, until the church clock struck 10. Then she straightened, pressed a hand to the small of her back, and walked down the lane to the village shop. Mrs. Biddle, the postmistress, was weighing sugar for old Mrs. Price. Morning, miss. Lovely day. Indeed. Tell me, Mrs. Biddle, did you notice anyone posting a blue envelope yesterday? Addressed to me. Mrs. Biddle pursed her lips. Can't say I did. But young Tommy Green was in helping with the parcels. He might have seen. Tommy, aged 12, was discovered behind the shop stacking lemonade crates. He scratched his head. There was a lady, miss. Tall, in a green coat. Came off the London train day before yesterday. Asked for a penny stamp and posted a blue letter in the box outside. Said she was staying at the Willow Tree. The Willow Tree was the village inn. Miss Marple thanked Tommy and walked the short distance to the inn yard. Mr. Pauk, the landlord, was polishing glasses. A lady in green? She came Tuesday evening, took the small back room, paid in advance. Said her name was Miss Rogers, but I misdoubted it hands too cared for, voice too refined. Left yesterday morning, bag and baggage. Said she had a telegram. From London? Didn't say. But the boy from the telegraph office brought one about 9 o'clock. She read it, turned white as chalk, packed in 5 minutes, and took the London train. Miss Marple returned home deep in thought. The mysterious Miss Rogers had arrived the day before Mrs. Rutherford, posted the threatening note, received a telegram, and fled. Coincidence? Unlikely? That afternoon, at the Women's Institute, Miss Marple presided over the jam-making competition with her usual gentle authority. Mrs. Harmon won with her blackberry and apple. Miss Marple awarded the prize and listened to the gossip. Funny thing, said Mrs. Dane, tying raffle tickets. Mrs. Rutherford's maid telephoned the vicarage this morning, wanted the address of anyone in Willowbrook who lets rooms. Said her mistress had left something behind yesterday, and only just missed it. Miss Marple's needle paused in the raffle cloth. Did she say what? A photograph in a leather frame. Very particular about it. So Mrs. Rutherford, despite her protestations, had not told the whole truth. She was searching for something more than the picture Miss Marple had burned. At 5 o'clock, Inspector Craddock telephoned from Scotland Yard. The London postmark is Charing Cross. Mrs. Rutherford arrived home at 9 last night alone. No visitors. But a man called this morning, tall, fair, military mustache. Stayed 10 minutes. We're trying to trace him. And the original photograph? Nothing yet. But I've put out a general call for any cabinet prints of Captain Haverford in naval uniform. There can't be many. Miss Marple thanked him and rang off. She stood in the hall, one hand on the banister, considering. Then she went upstairs to the spare room, still faintly scented with Mrs. Rutherford's lavender water, and examined the dressing-table drawer. Empty, but on the carpet beneath the bed lay a single pearl button small, perfect, the kind used on expensive gloves. She slipped it into an envelope and labeled it in her neat hand. Spare room, the 10th of October. Downstairs, the fire was low. Miss Marple added coal, drew the curtains against the October dusk, and took up her knitting. But her thoughts were not on the pattern. They were on a yacht in a Cornish cove, on a man who might not have died, on a woman who had burned one photograph and lost another, and on a third person, tall, fair, military, who had written damning words 20 years ago and now demanded £500 to keep silent. Outside, the wind rose, rattling the window panes like impatient fingers. Miss Marple knitted on, serene and watchful. Chapter 5. The second letter. The second letter arrived on a morning of thin fog that clung to the hedgerows and muffled the church bell. Miss Marple, having finished her porridge and seen Clara off to the butcher's, found the envelope lying on the mat with the rest of the post. It was identical to the first cheap blue paper, penciled address, London postmark of the previous day. She carried it to the sitting-room, slit it with the silver opener, and read, Old Mill, Willowbrook, midnight. Bring £500 in 5s and 10s. Come alone or the photograph goes to the police and the Denhams. No tricks, no signature, but the same blunt phrasing. Miss Marple turned the paper to the light. The pencil had been pressed hard. The indentations showed through. She laid it beside the first note on the mahogany table and compared them stroke for stroke. Identical pressure, identical slant. The writer was confident now, almost careless. She rang Scotland Yard. Inspector Craddock was out, but his sergeant promised to pass the message. Miss Marple then telephoned her nephew, Raymond Dane, the novelist, who lived in a flat off the King's Road and affected a disdain for the countryside. Raymond, dear, I need a small favor. Could you motor down this evening? Bring your revolver, the one you bought in Tangier, and a dark lantern. I require an escort to the old mill at midnight. Raymond, who had been hoping for material for a new thriller, arrived at 9 o'clock in a low-slung Meiji that scattered the village ducks. He was tall, untidy, and inclined to treat his aunt as a delightful anachronism. Really, Aunt Jane, midnight assignations. I shall put you in a book. You will do nothing of the sort, Miss Marple said firmly. You will park the car behind the mill, extinguish the lights, and wait until you hear 3 taps on the iron door. Then you will telephone Inspector Craddock at the willow tree. He will be in the private parlor and follow his instructions. And you will bring cocoa in a thermos. The night is damp. Raymond grinned. Yes, ma'am. At 11:30, Miss Marple donned her old black cloak, took a stout ash stick, and slipped the 2 notes into her handbag. She had wrapped a bundle of old seed catalogues in brown paper to the approximate size and weight of a packet of banknotes. Clara, who had been told only that her mistress was visiting a sick parishioner, watched her depart with misgivings. The lane to the mill was unlit. The fog turned the beam of Miss Marple's torch into a cone of swirling gray. The river murmured to her left, swollen by recent rain. The mill itself loomed ahead, a gaunt skeleton of stone and timber, its wheel long since removed. The iron door stood ajar. A faint glow showed within. Miss Marple stepped inside. The air smelled of damp brick and rotting grain. A lantern hung from a beam, casting a circle of yellow on the flagged floor. In the center stood a man, tall, fair, military mustache, a naval greatcoat buttoned to the throat. He held a service revolver. Miss Marple, I presume. His voice was educated, clipped. The money. She placed the brown paper parcel on a crate. First, the photograph. He smiled unpleasantly. You think to bargain? Very well. From an inner pocket, he drew a cabinet print in a small leather folder. He opened it. The seen yacht deck, captain, woman with turned face, but clear, the details sharp. On the back, in ink. She pushed him. I saw. Miss Marple's heart beat a little faster. You wrote that. I did. I was there. You were the crewman dismissed at Falmouth. Bosun, actually. Haverford owed me 6 months' wages. I hid in the chain locker, meaning to confront him at dawn. Instead, I saw murder. And waited 20 years to speak? Opportunities arise. Mrs. Rutherford's daughter is marrying into the peerage. Lord Denham pays well for clean linen. He picked up the parcel, weighed it. Feels light. Open it. He tore the paper. Seed catalogues fluttered out. His face darkened. At that moment 3 sharp taps sounded on the iron door. The man swung round, revolver raised. The door burst open. Inspector Craddock and 2 constables rushed in. Raymond followed, revolver in hand. Drop it, Haverford, Craddock barked. The man in the greatcoat laughed. Too late, Inspector. The name is Roger's Captain Reginald Haverford, drowned in 32. Remember? He fired once. The lantern exploded, plunging the mill into darkness. There was a scuffle, a grunt, the crash of a body against crates. When Raymond's torch found them, the man lay unconscious, a constable's boot on his wrist. The revolver had skidded into a corner. The photograph lay face down on the floor. Craddock picked it up, struck a match. Well, Aunt Jane? Miss Marple examined the print. A good copy, but not the original. The leather folder is new. The original was Morocco, cracked at the corners. And the ink on the back is fresh. Our friend is an opportunist, not a witness. The prisoner was hauled to his feet. Blood trickled from a cut on his forehead. Name? Craddock demanded. Rogers XRN, dishonorably discharged, 34. Been living on his wits since. And the real photograph? Rogers spat. Mrs. Rutherford has it. Always did. I sold her a fake 20 years ago. Said I'd seen the murder. Would keep quiet for a price. She paid. When the engagement was announced, I wrote again. She panicked, came here, burned the fake you gave her. But she still has the original locked in her safe at Cadogan Square." Miss Marple nodded. "The pearl button in the spare room was from her glove. She dropped it when she searched my handbag for the photograph she thought I still had. She believed the original was here." Craddock turned to the constables. "Take him to the station. Blackmail, attempted extortion, discharging a firearm. We'll add impersonating a dead man." As Rogers was led away, Miss Marple picked up the leather folder. A clever man, but greedy. He should have been content with the first payment. Raymond shivered. "Cocoa, Aunt Jane?" "In the car, dear, and then home. I have roses to prune tomorrow." They left the mill. The fog was lifting. A pale moon silvered the river. Behind them the old wheel creaked once, as though in protest, and was still. Chapter 6. The mill at midnight. The old mill stood on the bend of the river where the willows leaned like mourners, their roots drinking from the black water. By 11 o'clock the fog had thickened into a wet shroud. Every leaf dripped, and the lantern inside the mill glowed like a single malevolent eye. Miss Marple arrived first, having walked the last half-mile from the lane to avoid the crunch of Raymond's tires. She carried the brown paper parcel under one arm and her ash stick in the other hand. The revolver, lent by Raymond with reluctant pride, weighed heavy in her coat pocket. She had no intention of using it, but its presence was reassuring, like a well-thumbed Bible. She pushed the iron door. It groaned on rusty hinges. Inside, the lantern hung from a beam, swaying slightly so that shadows jittered across the broken sacks and the great millstones half buried in chaff. Footsteps scraped behind her. She turned. Captain Reginald Haverford, or the man who claimed that name, stepped from the deeper darkness. The greatcoat was buttoned to the chin, the mustache trimmed to naval points, the eyes hard and amused. In his right hand, the service revolver caught the lantern light. "Punctual, Miss Marple." "I admire punctuality." "The money." She placed the parcel on the nearest crate. "The photograph first." He smiled without warmth. "You are in no position to bargain." Yet he drew the leather folder from his pocket and flipped it open. The print was the same seen yacht deck, captain laughing, woman turning away, but the colors were richer, the grain finer. On the reverse, in ink that had browned with age, she pushed him. "I saw." Miss Marple's pulse quickened. "You were the boatswain." "Sharp, as reported." "Haverford dismissed the crew at Falmouth, said he wanted a quiet night with the ladies. I owed him money. He owed me wages. I hid in the chain locker with a bottle of rum. At 11 the storm rose. Voices on deck angry. Sylvia screaming that he would ruin them all with his debts. Then a shove, a cry, a splash. I saw the whole thing through the scuttle. When I climbed out, only the two women remained. Sylvia white as paper. Evelyn sobbing. They never knew I was there. And you waited 20 years. Patience is a virtue in my profession." He weighed the parcel. "Feels light. Open it." He tore the paper. Seed catalogs spilled across the crate. His face darkened to brick red. At that instant, 3 sharp taps rang on the iron door, clear, deliberate. A man swung round, revolver raised. The door burst inward. Inspector Craddock and 2 constables surged in, boots thudding on the flags. Raymond followed, revolver gleaming, eyes alight with the thrill of melodrama. "Drop it, Haverford." Craddock's voice cut through the gloom. The man in the greatcoat gave a short, contemptuous laugh. "Too late, Inspector. The captain is 20 years drowned." He fired. The lantern exploded in a shower of glass and oil. Flame licked up the beam. Darkness swallowed the mill, broken only by the orange flicker of burning kerosene. There was a grunt, a crash, the clatter of crates overturned. Miss Marple pressed back against the wall, ash stick ready. A constable swore. Another struck a match. By its flare, she saw Craddock pinning the blackmailer's arm, Raymond covering with the revolver, the second constable snapping handcuffs. The match died. The fire on the beam hissed in a puddle of oil and went out. Craddock's torch clicked on, steady and white. The prisoner was hauled upright. Blood ran from a cut above his eye. The mustache had slipped askew, revealing spirit gum. "Name?" Craddock demanded. "Rogers Leonard Rogers, late bosun. RN dishonorably discharged 34 for theft. Been living in Lisbon, Tangier, anywhere warm. Came back when I saw the engagement notice." Craddock picked up the leather folder from the floor. "And this?" "Original print. I lifted it from Evelyn's desk the night of the storm. Thought it might come in useful. Sylvia never knew I'd seen anything. Evelyn paid me £100 in '33 to keep quiet and another 50 in '35. When the girl's engagement was announced, I wrote again. She came here in a panic, burned the copy you gave her, but she still has the negative locked in her safe. I was going to sell her the original for 500. Miss Marple took the folder, opened it beneath the torch beam. The photograph was indeed the original, corners cracked, morocco frame worn soft. She slipped it into her handbag. "You forged the note on the back?" Rogers shrugged. "Added drama." Evelyn believed it. Craddock turned to the constables. "Take him to the station. Blackmail, extortion, discharging a firearm within enclosed premises. We'll add impersonation if the Director of Public Prosecutions is feeling imaginative." As Rogers was led away, muttering, Raymond let out a long breath. "Lord, Aunt Jane, you might have been shot." "Nonsense, dear." Inspector Craddock's timing was impeccable. She retrieved her ash stick and the scattered catalogues. "Though I shall have to explain to Mr. Sutton why his seed order is singed." Craddock struck another match, examined the mill. "No serious damage. The beam is charred but sound. I'll have the fire brigade check at dawn." He looked at Miss Marple. "Mrs. Rutherford will need to be interviewed. She has the negative and a great deal to explain." Miss Marple nodded. She believed she was protecting her daughter. Fear makes people foolish. They left the mill. The fog had thinned to a mist. The moon rode clear, silvering the river. The constable's boots crunched away down the path. Raymond opened the MG door with a flourish. "Cocoa, Aunt Jane? In the thermos, dear? And then home. I have a letter to write to Mrs. Rutherford before breakfast." The car purred into life. Behind them the mill stood silent, its secrets dragged into the light. Miss Marple leaned back against the leather, eyes half closed, already composing the gentle, inexorable sentences that would bring another phase of the affair to its close. Chapter 7. The Burning. The following morning broke clear and sharp, with a frost that silvered the grass and turned the breath of the milkman into small white clouds. Miss Marple rose at her usual hour, performed her modest toilet, and breakfasted on a boiled egg and thin toast. Clara, who had been told only that there had been a little excitement at the mill, bustled about with the air of one who suspects more than she is told and is determined not to ask. At 9 o'clock the telephone rang. Inspector Craddock's voice, crisp with London efficiency, came over the wire. "Mrs. Rutherford is here at the Yard. Aunt Jane. Arrived by the night sleeper. She has the negative and a full statement. I thought you might like to be present when we conclude matters." Miss Marple considered the chrysanthemums waiting to be tied up, the Women's Institute accounts waiting to be balanced, and the fact that Clara had promised to bottle damsons that afternoon. "I can be in town by luncheon," she said. The 10.15 from Willowbrook connects at Reading. She packed a small overnight bag nightdress, dressing gown, slippers, a clean handkerchief, and the leather folder containing the original photograph. At the station, she bought a third-class return and settled herself in a corner seat with the Times crossword. The train steamed out punctually. The frost melted into sparkling rills along the embankments. Scotland Yard at 11:30 was a hive of purposeful activity. A young constable escorted her to Craddock's office on the second floor. Mrs. Rutherford sat beside the desk, pale but composed, a cup of tea untouched before her. She wore the same black coat, but the veil was lifted, and her eyes were dry. "Miss Marple," she said, rising, "I owe you more than I can ever repay." "Sit down, my dear," Miss Marple said gently. "We are all here to find the truth, not to apportion blame." Craddock closed the door. On the blotter lay a glass negative in a yellow envelope and a typewritten statement of 3 pages. "Mrs. Rutherford has been most cooperative," he said. "The negative is the one she took herself on the yacht. She developed it in her husband's darkroom the following winter, made one print, the one you burned, and locked the negative away. She believed the matter closed." Mrs. Rutherford's hands twisted in her lap. "I was a fool. When the first letter came 20 years ago, I paid. £100 then, 50 later. I thought it finished. Then, last month, another demand. I panicked. My daughter's engagement, Lord Denham's pride." Her voice faltered. Miss Marple opened the leather folder and laid the photograph beside the negative. The images matched perfectly. "You kept the negative for insurance," she said, "in case the blackmailer returned." Mrs. Rutherford nodded. "I came to you because your name was mentioned in the newspapers, an old lady who understood human nature. I thought if anyone could make the letters disappear without scandal, it was you. And the burglary at my cottage? I searched your handbag while you were in the garden. I found nothing. I was frantic." Craddock cleared his throat. "Roger's real name, Leonard Rogers, has confessed to everything. He was indeed the boatswain. He saw nothing of the actual death. He was drunk in the chain locker. But he stole the camera from Miss Rutherford's cabin the next morning, developed the film in Falmouth, and kept the negative. He forged the note on the back of the print to give himself leverage. The murder was pure invention." Mrs. Rutherford looked up. "Then Sylvia Mrs. Haverford did not push him?" "No evidence whatever," Craddock said. "The inquest was correct. Accidental death. Captain Haverford was intoxicated, the deck slippery, the rail low. He fell. Rogers embellished the story for profit." Miss Marple turned to Mrs. Rutherford. "You have carried guilt for 20 years because you doubted your cousin's widow. Doubt is a heavy burden, but it is not the same as complicity." Mrs. Rutherford's eyes filled. "If Caroline's marriage is safe—" "It is," Craddock said. "Lord Denham has been informed discreetly that an attempt at blackmail was made and foiled. No details of the yachting tragedy need be revived. Rogers will be charged with extortion and firearms offenses. He will not trouble you again." He opened a drawer and took out a small metal tray and a box of matches. "The negative and the print, Mrs. Rutherford, unless you wish to keep them as souvenirs of a painful episode." Mrs. Rutherford shook her head. "Burn them, please." Craddock struck a match. The negative curled first, the emulsion bubbling, then the print captain, woman, yacht deck blackened, and vanished into fragile ash. He ground the ash with a brass paperweight. "There," he said. "Closed." Mrs. Rutherford stood. "I shall go home and tell Caroline the whole truth, my part, at least. She is stronger than I was at her age." Miss Marple rose also. "Truth is always best, my dear. But remember, truth need not be cruel. A simple accident, long ago, need not cast a shadow over a young girl's happiness." They parted in the corridor. Mrs. Rutherford to her taxi, Miss Marple to the Yard's canteen for a cup of tea before the return train. Craddock walked with her. "You suspected from the first that the photograph I burned was a copy," he said. "I suspected Mrs. Rutherford was not telling all. The handwriting on the back was wrong, and she was too eager to destroy evidence. Fear makes people transparent. And Rogers? A type one meets in villages, charming, dishonest, always one step ahead until greed trips him. He should have been content with the first £100. The tea was strong and hot. Miss Marple added milk, but no sugar. "Will you stay in town tonight?" Craddock asked. No, Dermot. The damsons will not bottle themselves, and Clara worries if I am late. The 2.15 from Paddington deposited her at Willowbrook Halt at 20 minutes past 4. The frost had gone. The air smelled of wood smoke and fallen leaves. She walked home through the lane, nodding to Mrs. Biddle at the post office, to old Mr. Pettigrew on his bench. Linden Cottage welcomed her with the scent of roasting apples. Clara's apology for the upset routine. That evening, after supper, Miss Marple sat by the fire with her knitting. The bed jacket was nearly finished. Only the border remained. She worked steadily, the needles clicking like a quiet clock. Outside, the village settled into its familiar hush. Somewhere a dog barked once and was still. She thought of the Yacht sea nymph, of a man who had laughed too loudly and drunk too deeply, of 2 women left alone on a storm-tossed deck, of a negative burning in a metal tray at Scotland Yard. All traces gone, all threats dissolved. Yet memory remained hers, and Mrs. Rutherford's, and perhaps Caroline's one day, when she was old enough to understand the frailty that lies beneath the surface of even the most respectable lives. Miss Marple tied off the wool, snipped the thread, and held up the bed jacket to the lamplight. The pattern was perfect. She folded it neatly, placed it in tissue paper, and set it aside for the bazaar. Then she drew the curtains, banked the fire, and went up to bed. In Willowbrook, the church clock struck 10, clear and unhurried. Another mystery resolved, another small corner of human nature laid bare and gently covered again. Miss Marple slept soundly, as those do who have done their duty without fuss or ostentation. The photograph she burned, Miss Marple's midnight blackmail mystery,